I'm the Philosophical Bachelor, and today I'm going to talk about The World as Will and Representation by Arthur Schopenhauer. This is going to be about his first volume of the book. Arthur Schopenhauer proves that one big thought is all it takes to go down in the history of human intellection. He builds his entire career on the single thought that the world is simply two aspects, representation and will, and that is all the world is. All his works center around this thought. He is surprisingly consistent throughout his publications, which is also what allows him to cross-reference them continually in his different works. However, this single thought, is most explicated in The World as Will and Representation, published in 1818 when he is just 30 years old. The title of the book tells us precisely the kind of thinker he is. It already sums up everything so you know exactly what you're in for even before you turn to the book's first page. It is a rather thick book, some 600 pages long, and that is just volume 1. He published an even thicker second volume in 1844, some 26 years later, to further elaborate upon volume 1, so you can see how committed he is to his one big thought. I have just completed reading volume 1, and thick as it is, he is mercifully an excellent writer, explaining himself clearly and making the effort to reiterate key points so as to make sure his audience understands. It helps if you are acquainted with the wave of German idealism beginning with Immanuel Kant in the 18th century, some ancient Greek philosophy such as Plato, and the Hindu Upanishads. Schopenhauer is a man of great erudition, conversant in a slew of languages, including French, Greek, Latin, Italian, English, and of course his native German. He is acquainted with the scientific literature of his day and uses them to reinforce his own thinking. He quotes ancient, medieval, and contemporary texts in their original language, using them to enliven his text to great effect, which fortunately are relegated to the footnotes in my translation of The World as Will and Representation, which is the Cambridge edition published in 2010, translated by Judith Norman, Alistair Welshman, and Christopher Yanaway. In my opinion, his lucid writing as a reflection of his lucid thinking, in addition to his great learning, is something to be aspired to for all philosophers. He does have one downside in that he rails at those thinkers that he considers to be not so lucid, most obviously Hegel, but also Fichte, Schelling, and Schleiermacher. It may be amusing when his readers encounter it for the first time, but wearing on the umpteenth mention. He clearly has a chip on his shoulder since he feels slighted by the Academy, even more so when he feels it promotes those less worthy than himself. Schopenhauer follows in the footsteps of the great systematic philosophers such as Spinoza, Leibniz, and Kant. The 4 books that comprise The World as Will and Representation cover epistemology, metaphysics, aesthetics, and ethics respectively. Book 1 describes how we gain knowledge of the world through representations. Book 2 proposes a metaphysics describing the fundamental nature of the world, that is, the will. Book 3 talks about how art in all its forms, from painting, sculpture, poetry, literature to music, can help us assess the true idea of things, and he concludes in Book 4 with the kind of life one should lead, proposing an ethics given his metaphysics of our reality. The World as Representation, Book 1. Representation is what we cognize of the world when we take in raw sense data through our senses and process it through our faculty of understanding. Because everything we sense is cognized through such a process, we are unable to cognize the thing in itself, but only the representations we have of them, as a subject who cognizes objects. This world of representation is hence subject to the structure of our cognition. This structure comprises conditions which are in place even without any experience. To enable us to cognize the external world at all, we must already have these conditions, this structure, these forms, before we can understand what we sense. Hence they are a priori. These conditions have already been posited by Kant as comprising 12 categories, space and time, but Schopenhauer shortens his account to only one principle, the principle of sufficient reason, discarding all 12 categories for just this one principle, with space and time as part of the principle of sufficient reason. Space-time and the principle of sufficient reason are the forms by which we understand objects and are not in the objects themselves. Space and time are what allows the various objects to be separated from one another into a multiplicity to be relative to one another. Space positions objects relative to each other, while time positions objects to succeed one another. The principle of sufficient reason has 4 roots or dimensions. 1. The physical root is about causality, which is cause and effect. 2. The logical root is about our judgment or how our reasoning operates from ground to consequent when we explain our thoughts. Our reasoning is in turn grounded by 4 fundamental concepts. A. Logical deduction. B. Empirical truth. C. Transcendental truth, that is, synthetic a priori concepts. And D. Metalogical truth, or the conditions that make thinking possible, such as the principle of identity, non-contradiction, the excluded middle, and sufficient reason. 3. The mathematical root is about the relativity of space and time. A part or a being is constituted by its relations to other parts and beings in the succession of time and its position in space. 4. The practical, which Schopenhauer calls moral, root is about motives as a cause of actions of our will. Objects as representation obey the principle of sufficient reason without fail. As representations, the relations between objects are deterministic because every effect can be traced back to its causes. In the world as representation, we cannot know the thing in itself because we are unable to surpass our cognitive apparatus to know the things in themselves, according to Kant's transcendental idealism. However, Schopenhauer realizes a way to get to the things in themselves, to know their essence, which he calls will. When I look at my own body, I see and cognize a representation of my body. I, as subject, view this body as an object. However, since I directly experience my inner life, I intuit my own will. This thought of Schopenhauer's is a breakthrough which draws from René Descartes' cogito ergo sum, or I think, therefore I am, where even if I doubt the existence of everything else, there must be something that is doing the doubting, a doubter. That doubter is myself, which therefore must exist in order that I can even begin to doubt to begin with. Kant did not manage to make that Cartesian leap, but Schopenhauer did. Hence I know that at least for myself, I have both a will, which is not my body, and a representation, which is my body. I am the subject when I cognize objects in the external world, but when other objects cognize me, I am the object while they are the subject. Since I know, as a subject that is also an object, that I have both an inner will and an outer representation, then I can infer that other objects likewise have an inner will and an outer representation. So what does it mean to infer? Cognition. So far we have talked about cognition in terms of our faculty of understanding. This faculty is not unique to human beings. Animals also have it, and it is how animals cognize the world. When we cognize objects, we are intuiting them. Intuition is what arises from the immediate effects of objects on our bodies. When we experience an object, what is happening is that our understanding intuits the effects of the object on our body and understands these effects to be caused by the object. Our cognition has another faculty, the faculty of reason. Schopenhauer believes that this ability to reason is unique to human beings. What happens when we reason is that we form abstractions from the representations we encounter. These abstractions are concepts which we then use to reason about things we do not immediately intuit. An example are triangles. We encounter physical triangular objects like a slice of pizza or an arrowhead, which we intuit using our understanding. We then use our reason to abstract from these particular triangles to a concept of triangles, idealized triangles that we can still reason about even in the absence of actual triangles. Reason gives rise to knowledge, while understanding gives rise to intuitions. The World as Will, Book 2. What then is the will, and how does it relate to the world? We commonly refer to willings as our desires, as what we want. Though Schopenhauer incorporates this notion of desire into his concept of will, by will he means the essence of a thing. For him, everything has a will, even inanimate objects. The will is a blind force that firstly wills to persist and secondly for things that can reproduce to procreate. For him, the will is a will to life. The will to procreate is a way for the will to persist even after the death of the subject of the individual will. The body is an objectification of the will. It is our will, our essence, expressing itself as a physical object. This applies also to the parts of our body. For our will to persist, we need nutrition and hence we have digestive organs. For our will to procreate, we need sex and hence we have sexual organs. All the organs, including our brain, our intellectual apparatus, are merely tools of the will. The will is not subject to the principle of sufficient reason, since the principle, like time and space, is a condition of our cognition and is not in the thing in itself, that is, not in the will. Time, space, and causality applies to our representation of things. They are what we use in our cognition, specifically our understanding, to understand representations. They are what we overlay into our representation of things so that we can understand them and not in the things themselves. There is the individual will, which all things have specific to themselves, what he calls the principium indivisionis, or the principle of individuation. And then there is the universal will, which is the will of the world as one entity. I think the best way to understand this is that the individual wills are just part of the universal will, and hence have a limited autonomy of their own. The interest of the universal will is for nature to persist, and is not concerned with the survival of the individual beings that collectively make up nature. Even if one individual human being dies, another replaces it. What it wills is for the continuance of the species, of all of nature, which is served by the endless striving of the individual wills. As such, the will is a blind striving. For living things, this will strives to attain sufficient nutrition in order to survive, to persist. However, once that is achieved, it does not mean that the will is sated. It continues to strive. So in human beings who are endowed with reason, the will creates projects to strive after, feeding us the illusion that once we achieve these projects, we will achieve lasting happiness, but that is not the nature of the will. Once a project has been achieved, we may experience temporary satisfaction, but the will then seeks out new projects, which then lead to a renewed striving to achieve them. When we are unable to find new projects to strive after, what we have is not happiness or peace, but instead restless boredom. Even if we manage to coerce other people into serving us to help us achieve our projects, we still cannot escape striving, because the striving of our will does not stop. If we have nothing to strive for because others are serving us and doing it all for us, we are still not at peace, since instead we just feel bored. When we use our will to force other people to strive for our projects against their will, essentially appropriating their will, we are unjust. This is Schopenhauer's definition of justice. He is of the view that even in the state of nature, the idea of fairness and justice is already there, and hence from then on, we know that we should not intrude on other people's wills to extend our own. He thinks that in society, the reason for the law to set out punishment must not be retributive but punitive. The law must make it unattractive for criminals to intrude on other people's will, and by extension, their property, so as to deter such acts in the future, but not merely to take revenge on the offenders, as two wrongs do not make a right. To strive after something means to lack that thing, which is why striving is required in the first place. Schopenhauer considers this lack as suffering. Since striving does not end even after we manage to accumulate many things, suffering is a fundamental condition of life, not just human life, but all life. Similar to the Epicureans, joy or happiness is for Schopenhauer not a positive notion where something is attained, but a negative one where suffering is alleviated. To achieve happiness is hence to escape suffering, and that means to escape the striving of the will. He sees two ways of doing this. The first way, only a temporary reprieve, while the second way is more permanent. Schopenhauer's Ethical Solution, Book 3 and 4. The first way involves the suspension of our will through the enjoyment of art. He thinks that genuine artists are those with such genius, such that they are able to, in their cognition, penetrate to the essence of objects and skilled enough to portray these essences in their works. We are then able to, as it were, borrow their eyes to assess the essence of things, and in that moment forget ourselves and the striving of our will. Such an aesthetic experience is, however, temporary. The permanent way is asceticism, where one negates one's will through the rejection of the striving of the will. Recall that for Schopenhauer, happiness is not a positive concept. It is a negative one, where happiness is the alleviation of suffering. Many people do not come to the realization that the way to achieve lasting happiness is to negate the will. These people instead obey the dictates of the will and experience endless striving, which gives them temporary satisfaction upon achieving those strivings, but extended suffering since they are mostly striving to fulfill a lack or are bored after they have achieved what they thought would satisfy them. How can one come to realize that instead of obeying the will to achieve happiness, the way instead is to negate the will? Schopenhauer conceives two ways. The first is when we see through the illusion of life, realizing that the promise of lasting happiness cannot be from achieving our projects, since that way is one of endless striving or boredom. Instead, we need to tranquilize the will, to numb it so as to deny its demands and strivings. So the first way is the way of pure rationalization, where we reason out what we have to do and then proceed to do it, to deny the will through ascetic practices. The second way is the way of suffering, where we suffer so much that we seek out the source of our suffering and come to the realization that it is our will and its endless striving that is the source. An attentive reader may wonder, wouldn't the ending of life itself be the ultimate way to negate one's will? On the contrary, Schopenhauer condemns suicide. Far from being a negation of the will, he sees it as giving in to one's will. The will realizes that its host is in some way inept to be able to satisfy its strivings, and hence affirms itself through the very abolition of its appearance, because it can no longer affirm itself in any other way. Suicide is an avoidance of suffering, but Schopenhauer thinks that a person who commits suicide is mistaken because suffering is essential to life. Suffering is a part of life, the very essence of life, and avoiding it through suicide is not a victory over suffering, but instead a capitulation to one's will, destroying life but not the will to life. As mentioned, one's suffering can lay the path that leads one to the realization that the ultimate solution is the negation of the will, that is, to break the will, and hence have redemption from the endless strivings of the will. Instead, the one who commits suicide is like a sick person who, having started undergoing a painful operation that could cure him completely, does not allow it to be completed and would rather stay sick, writes Schopenhauer. Conclusion. Schopenhauer is known as the philosopher of pessimism. He thinks that optimism for this life is mistaken. He views suffering as a necessary condition of life for all things, and to top it off, suffering culminates in human beings, since human beings possess the faculty of reason, which then creates a novel layer of anguish arising from the thoughts of the suffering in addition to the actual pain itself. However, he does present a solution, the negation of the will, and hence is not a complete pessimist who would think that there is no way out whatsoever. Despite Schopenhauer building up a solid case beginning with his insightful metaphysics and leading to his conclusion of the negation of the will, his solution of asceticism can nevertheless be challenged. We may feel that he is right in that there is no end to our problems. Even after our big difficulties are resolved, minor ones will come to replace them and may then come to loom as large as them. We may have to combat boredom after our successes. Indeed, we may from our sufferings come to see through the illusion of life, this veil of Maya that he borrows from Hindu philosophy. But why is asceticism the answer? Friedrich Nietzsche, who called Schopenhauer his great teacher, comes to the exact opposite conclusion. Instead of negating the will to life, we should affirm it as a will to power, as a self-overcoming for creative self-actualization to become an Übermensch. He accuses Schopenhauer of a Euro-Buddhism, which in this case is not inaccurate, since the notion of retreating from the world is borrowed from monastic and mendicant religious traditions. In addition, there are many other ways to forget yourself, including meditation, which Schopenhauer is familiar with, achieving a flow through mastery and being in the moment, referencing George Bataille. We can concede that all of these may be discontinuous or unsustainable over a long period. However, in the vein of Nietzsche's will to power and the philosophy of existentialism, one can seek out a consuming passion that is rich enough to sustain a person over their lifetime, finding satisfaction in the work itself and not just only from the results of the work, echoing Simone de Beauvoir. Examples include the project of creating art, which Schopenhauer himself extols, or philosophizing, which Schopenhauer enacts. His own life in the pursuit of philosophy is an example of an alternative to asceticism. He did not become a monk, but instead wrote books, sought out academic positions, and mooted projects such as translating Hume and Kant, albeit without success. Is the process of creation not itself somewhat joyful? Is it merely a suffering that must await the brief triumph of the project's completion and success? We need to find work that is worth doing in itself, for its own sake, regardless of whatever rewards it brings. If Schopenhauer did not finally find success in his later years, would he have considered that his work was completely futile? Did not his contemplative efforts leading up to his discovery of the world as will and representation, and then putting pen to paper, not bring him some happiness? While I feel his ethical conclusion is debatable, I think that Schopenhauer's metaphysics of the world as two sides of the same coin, representation and will, is sound and convincing. I think his solution to Kant's problem of the noumena is brilliant. Solutions that are brilliant are the ones where, after they have been understood, seems almost obvious, though they were of course not obvious until they were disseminated. His account of life speaks to me. I identify with many of his notions, such as the continuous anxiety and suffering that seems to be a part of the human condition, the Pascalian boredom that plagues us after accomplishment, and the sense of endless striving which we seem almost compelled to undergo, today ubiquitous in the rat race which many people seem to have no choice but to participate in, first as a matter of mere survival and then later as a matter of keeping up appearances. I can see how his metaphysics leads to the conclusion of asceticism as the solution, though it is clearly not a path just anyone can undertake, requiring physical and mental preparation, a making of peace with oneself, pretty much what those who renounce the world and religious traditions have to do to get ready before entering their monasteries. I think he is right though to say that we need to see through the unreality of how things seem, and in that way become more compassionate, not just towards others, but also towards ourselves. Since the world as representation is merely an illusion, and we have recognized the real world of will as one of endless blind striving, we can respond in a suitable way, asceticism being one solution among several to try to chart our own path. I do not know if Schopenhauer addresses any alternatives in his second volume, since I have not yet begun reading it at the time of this writing. I hope he does, and I do look forward to new discoveries for myself in his second volume. Thank you.